So it seems that top Dark Angel's armies have discovered the joys of the Dread Elite of the Deathwing again, following the enormous buffs to Deathwing Knights. Let's talk about the squad, and the sheer amount of damage and tankiness that they can bring to the table right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Dark Angels and Deathwing in particular. And in this video I thought we'd take a focused look at the Deathwing Knights, talking briefly about the miniatures and then doing a full datasheet review with a look at their damage, durability and how people are running them in competitive right now. They're definitely a datasheet that Games Workshop gave a pretty massive glow up to in the latest balance update, and one that sorely needed one. I was certainly kind of interested to see exactly how their power weapons and maces of absolution will be stacking up with the new rules. In the lore, the Deathwing Knights are basically the champions of the Inner Circle, already a ridiculously elite Terminator formation of the Dark Angels' first company. Chaos and Xenos across the galaxy have come to dread the sight of the bone-coloured Terminator armour. Powerful veterans all ready to go toe-to-toe with the shock elite of the enemy forces and win. And of course, being the Dark Angels, they're the guardians of terrible secrets. Their primary task being the sword that cuts through the ranks of the fallen. Heretical Dark Angels usually first identified by the Raven Wing and then calling in the Deathwing for the killing blow. The Deathwing Knights themselves are, if anything, the high elite out of this already elite Terminator formation, veterans of countless campaigns and deployed with full melee war gear, mighty storm shields embossed with the logos of the Deathwing, and fighting with power weapons or maces of absolution. As 40k miniature releases go, the Deathwing Terminators were perhaps one of the best received kits model-wise in quite a while. Most people really quite liking the Terminators but more knightly aesthetic that they have going on, even if the old ones did have a good amount of charm to them as well. They now get the option to be able to fight with swords, which are all very iconic for the Dark Angels, or those maces of absolution paired with the storm shields, plus a big relic weapon or great weapon of Caliban for the Knight Master Sergeant. The helms and styling have a bit of a nod to the Heresy era Dark Angels models, which are nice I think. There was a little bit of sadness that the box set doesn't build the Deathwing Command Squad, which now has been removed as an option. The kit costs £44, €55 or $70 for 5 of them. It also comes with a teleport homer and a watcher in the dark. They are a bit more pricey than standard Terminators, Games Workshop getting away with charging more for chapter specific sculpts and being extra elite I suppose. Though as it goes, their points per dollar really aren't bad as 40k is concerned. They're back up to 235 points again, and at 3.4 points per dollar, that's one of the best offerings for Space Marines right now. Almost everything else is less than that, including the majority of combat patrols. As ever, if you were thinking about picking some Deathwing Knights up, or any other 40k miniatures, I do have a bunch of discount links in the video description from official third-party retailers that can save you a bit of money versus Games Workshop. Anything bought through them does help to support the channel as well. Can just be one way to help out a bit if you were going to buy something anyway. Let's get into the rules though and take a look at the datasheet for the Deathwing Knights. They're 235 points for 5 of them now. You can only take 5, no more, no less. A change that was made in the Codex that stops you making just one ridiculously enormous unit of 470 odd points. Possibly Games Workshop thinking that that might be just a bit crazy in terms of the synergies that you could give them. At the 235 points though, with their current rules, I feel like they certainly bring enough damage and defense to the table to warrant support. In any case, they broadly have a Terminator stat line with movement 5, inbuilt deep strike and objective control 1. They do have a whole ton of their own advantages. First up, for their durability, this feels like perhaps the standout thing for the Deathwing Knights. They are pretty much the toughest Terminators in the game. 4 wounds due to their storm shields, all at toughness 5, a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable. And then their Inner Circle rule means that you subtract 1 from the damage characteristic of each attack that hits them. So damage 3 goes to damage 2, or damage 2 goes to damage 1 for example. This combined with having 4 wounds just makes them ridiculously tanky to take out. Damage 1 weapons don't care about the -1 damage thing, but they're not usually going to be the go-to choice to take out 4 wound Terminators in the first place. Damage 2 literally has its output cut in half. Damage 3 might be the optimal thing to take them down with, but still compared with having to get 5 wounds through against a standard Terminator squad, you have to get 10 wounds through against this squad, and that's not going to be an easy thing with good saves and invulnerables. And then even if you want to flat out destroy one with a massive damage attack, you're going to need a damage 5 hit or better. So that means that even if you get a hit through with a las cannon, there's no guarantee that you're going to actually kill a Deathwing Knight in one shot. Overall, it's pretty intimidating stuff, and they're going to soak up a bunch of damage no matter what it comes from. In theory, mortal wounds and devastating wounds might be the single best thing against them, but they also have a cover for that. A once per game Watcher in the Dark that can give you a 4+ feel no pain against mortal wounds. So it should lessen the blow if the opponent has something good to focus on with that kind of damage output. Between all that, they're basically just going to take a whole load of effort to down any one Deathwing Knight. I can always spike high with saves with those 4+ invulnerable saves, shrugging off a lot of damage that might have statistically taken down a good amount of them. Moving on to their melee damage, and this was the bit that was buffed in the balanced data slate. The Mace of Absolution gained an extra pip of AP and anti-monster and anti-vehicle keywords, so you get 4 attacks, hitting on a 2+ at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2, but it wounds most tough stuff on a 4+ at worst. The other option is the power weapon, which basically has the same profile as the Mace of Absolution now. That one gained a +1 damage in the data slate. And it's basically the Mace of Absolution, lacking the anti-monster and anti-vehicle, but getting +1 attack, so you've got 5 attacks rather than 4. Here's the damage breakdown between the two profiles. Basically, as you'd expect, the swords do better against anything that isn't a monster or vehicle, given that they've just got a flat better profile against anything that isn't. And the maces do better against any monster and vehicle targets that the swords will be wounding on a 5+ or worse. Either way though, the unit really is quite a general purpose one in my opinion. This is the damage output for 4 knights, not including the Knight Master, and recorded in wounds dealt. It means that both flavours of just the rank and file members of the squad should be destroying over 10 Horde models, somewhere between 6 and 8 regular Space Marines, 2 or 3 Terminators, and around about 8 or 9 wounds to a light tank like a Rhino or a Gladiator tank or something. I feel like the only massive difference between the profiles is the Land Raider target, where the swords are wounding on a 6, so they get less than half the damage of the maces there. In competitive lists, the vast majority of people seem to be going for maces, which I can't really see why. I feel like you've got enough damage output to threaten most medium infantry still really quite well with that, and not having to go overboard. And the maces just make it a bit more general purpose and threaten tough stuff as well, so basically if you charge this squad into literally anything, you know they're going to have some good effect. Whether it's a horde of termagants, some enemy terminators, or a mighty land raider or toughness 12 knight. I guess in theory the swords could be a bit better for certain to wound buffs, things like Lance and Gladius, or the +1 to wound from the Inner Circle Task Force, or an attached chaplain. They could have them outperforming against the Rhino target with the +1 to wound there. In general, the maces won't care quite as much about that, given that it doesn't really work with the anti-keywords if they are wounding on a 5 buffed to a 4. Overall though, I would say they're both usable. If you happen to have modelled up all of your guys with the swords, I still think that that's a pretty reasonable choice. Just for interest's sake, here's the comparison of the old profiles for the maces and swords versus the new ones before the balanced data slate buffs. It does kind of highlight that the new unit is just ferociously more dangerous than the old one. The previous unit would have killed around about 1 less Terminator than the new one can. And they're certainly crazily better against tough stuff. Regardless of loadout, you're getting around about double damage or better against monsters and vehicle targets. So they're quite a lot more general purpose now and won't fall down flat against a tough vehicle with a good save. They did increase plus 20 points from the previous loadout, so there was a bit of a trade-off. Technically they're a little bit less durable per point now as well. But it seems that people have considered this easily worth it to be able to just threaten just about anything in the game and maybe reach critical mass against monsters and vehicle targets they might not have been doing before. Then the Knight Master gets a fun weapon, either a Caliban Great Weapon, which has a similar profile to the previous Flail of the Unforgiven, or a Relic Weapon. Again, these ones are interesting, but I think at least somewhat well balanced. The Relic Weapon gets lethal hits and 6 attacks at Strength 7, AP 2, Damage 2. The Flail of the Unforgiven gets a more similar profile to the Power Weapon, but gains both sustained hits and devastating wounds as well. They are basically pretty great though, just general purpose melee weapons that are going to cause damage no matter what you hit with them. The damage output for those is at least fairly well balanced on paper, kind of a wash against Horde targets or standard Space Marines. The great weapons win out very slightly against high save targets like Terminators, so the Relic Weapon on paper wins against things like Land Raiders or Rhinos, where the lethal hits tips the balance there. The damage numbers do seem to be close enough to not matter to a crazy extent though, and again I feel like you're not really losing much to go with one or the other. In competitive play, I've seen far more people opting for the great weapon or the flail out of the two. I'm going to guess that's primarily because of the devastating wounds it can get. It does mean that if you're fighting something that's got a very high invulnerable save, or maybe has, say, a 2+ save with Armor of Contempt, then getting the extra mortal wound damage is probably going to tip the equation compared with the relic weapon. Either way, the Knightmaster's pretty fearsome and is going to carry a good chunk of his squad's damage. Kind of nice that he can survive until the last miniature alive. Overall, putting that together, here's the damage output of the squad. This is the total of 4 of them with maces and 1 with the great weapon. For Horde, it's around about 15 slain termagants, a full squad of space marines of around about 8 to 9 intercessors, 3 or 4 enemy terminators taken down. Should be destroying most standard battle tanks in a single round of combat with 12 wounds to a rhino, or even 8 wounds to something like a mighty Land Raider. Compared with the numbers that I had prior to the update, it's around about 15% or so damage buff against the various infantry types, but massively better against the vehicles if you're taking the maces, around about plus 50% damage to the rhino, and then around about double damage to the Land Raider. Overall, between all that, they're just a very dangerous and very durable unit. I feel like there's easily enough of both of those to justify the 235 points, and no matter what sort of gun the enemy points at them, it's likely not going to feel particularly great against them between all the barriers to damage, with the mass wounds, good saves, good invulnerable saves, -1 damage, feel no pain against mortal wounds, and also being able to threaten cover and Armor of Contempt as well. For their weaknesses, they are slow when they're on the board and can be harder to deliver than some melee units, and they do have low objective control. They're likely going to want to be fighting over the mid-board objectives, but they do just have the chance where even if they can kill a bunch of enemy, they might be outscored if the opponent can maybe get just a few models of troops on there. For supporting the Deathwing Knights in-game, Oath of Moment is best directed elsewhere. Hitting on a 2+ already just means that there's limited scope for improving their hits. In a way though, that's kind of nice that you can save that big damage buff to help out something else in your army, unless literally every iota of damage is massively important to their combat. They can make good use of a bunch of the more standard stratagems. As I mentioned, Armor of Contempt is great with 2+ saves, making AP1 save on a 2+, or even AP2 save on a 2+ if you're in cover. Heroic Intervention is far more usable for them, 1 command point to jump into combat with something else, and they do have the durability to survive against most things hitting them first. Could be particularly nasty if they're paired with another unit and they can both support each other, whether it's Deathwing Knights or something different. Otherwise, to get them there, they could Deep Strike for a 27% chance to make a 9-inch charge, going up to a 47% with a command point reroll. They do seem like, on paper, a great unit to rapid ingress. Have them turn up just greater than 9 inches from the enemy, maybe a bit further if you don't want them charged first perhaps. Ideally try and hide them, but if not, it's not the worst given how tough they are. And then hopefully be able to get a pretty guaranteed charge the next turn. Otherwise, I guess you could use a Land Raider to deliver them to melee, though it's not really like they need the durability protection of it, given that they're dead tough already. Foot slogging could be an absolutely fine way to get them there, just to move up to central mid-board objectives. I feel like that's going to be a bit more interesting in Detachments, where they can advance and charge like the Gladius task force. For character support options, they've got loads of things that they can choose, though it seems to be generally considered that they're just not really needed to be supported with the character right now. The squad does have enough base damage and defense, and you're already committing 235 points to a unit. It certainly doesn't seem like it's an auto-include to add more. From the Dark Angels Codex, there's only Belial that can join them, and the main thing that he brings is precision, which unfortunately just isn't really all that exciting. Great in certain matchups, but not very good in others. Otherwise, you've got the Captain for re-rolling charges and cheaper stratagems, which definitely could be interesting enough. The Terminator Chaplain for +1 to wound and the Mortal Wound defense. The +1 to wound could be better for the power weapons, but isn't likely to be as big for the maces. And I guess Mortal Wound defense is nice, but they do already have that Watcher in the Dark. The Terminator Librarian gives them sustained hits on 6s, so a +20% damage boost for the unit, though if you're taking the Great Weapon then that already gets it. For the most part, I can't see that having as much impact as the +1 to wound boost from the Chaplain. I guess you get a bit of psychic shooting though. And finally, the Terminator Ancient does give you extra OC, which is quite a big deal. Having 12 OC total with a unit could make them really quite a lot more intimidating to try and take off the mid-board. Though you are paying really quite a big premium at 75 points to do so. And it's kind of a shame for them that his inbuilt buff won't really help them out too much, given that they already hit on a 2+. So it's only going to matter if they're killed down to just 1 or 2 Deathwing Knights left to activate his wound boost. Overall, between all that, I feel like maybe the Chaplain, Captain and Ancient are perhaps the most interesting ones, though none of them seem enormously stand out. It could perhaps be a way of getting an enhancement in the unit if you wanted one from a detachment. For the Dark Angels detachment, the obvious one is the Inner Circle task force, which does have a lot of good stuff for them. They get +1 to wound on all the objectives that you didn't hold at the start of the turn, so it can be quite nice for moving on to objectives and destroying the stuff that's there. Again though, this one will matter a bit more if you're not fighting a monster and vehicle with the maces, but against everything else will make the squad a fair bit more scary. There's an enhancement on offer for first turn deep strike, which could be interesting, plus stratagems for a scary 3-inch deep strike if you wanted to throw Deathwing Knights into the enemy's backfield and cause big problems. Rerolling wound rolls against things on objectives, which would take them to the next level, particularly if they were wounding on a 4+ with those anti-keywords. A nice -1 to wound in the shooting phase, just in case you wanted pretty much none of them to die. And a Fights in Death one on a 4+, which I feel like you'd have to get hit by something incredibly scary in combat to make that worth it, just because there's a good chance that not that many of them are going to get killed to any one thing in combat. In general, they do feel like one of the units that's most worth supporting with this detachment. It does have a fair bit of good stuff for them. Otherwise, for the Codex detachments, the Unforgiven task force does have a couple of things that feels way more niche. There's a stratagem for lethal hits if it made sense, and a -1 to wound if you charge debuff. That one does cost a big 2 CP though. Otherwise, you could get a Penitent of Remembrance in the unit for a Feel No Pain if you wanted one more barrier to damage. And I feel that actually the extra objective control buff that they got in the balanced data slate might be more helpful on these guys versus anything else. They are quite likely to be fighting on the mid-board objectives and have less objective control than you'd like. And I feel like that makes them stand out a bit better in that detachment. At least in the first few weeks after the Pariah Nexus update though, it does seem that people have been having far more success in Gladius with them. Top performing lists often running 3-4 units of Deathwing Knights, kind of showing that they're pretty solid for the Dark Angels in general, and just Space Marines as well, as they are competing against all the other options for Space Marines for Assault Infantry. The biggest thing for them in Gladius I think is the Advance and Charge, really quite a massive deal for units starting on the board and actually getting where they need to. You can have one big turn of en masse Advance and Charge with the Assault Doctrine, and then flex into it for 1 command point for a unit whenever you need it. That's increased them from an average 12-inch charge threat range to more like 15 or 16 or so, and that's a whole world of difference for slow, dangerous and tanky units. Beyond that, they do also have some nice stratagems. Lance and an extra AP -1 when they're in the Assault Doctrine is a pretty big one. Lance will be a bit more relevant if they're not using the anti-keywords though, I guess. And also having access to that reactive movement stratagem is really big for such a threatening unit. They can move d6 inches in response to an enemy and maybe either keep the unit safe or move away from charges, going up to a full 6 inches if they're in Tactical Doctrine. Overall, I feel like that's the detachment that probably gains them the most compared with all the rest. They do have the Terminator keyword for the first company task force, so you could repeatedly deep strike them around the board, though I'm not sure that's necessarily the best thing. It just feels like doing that with a dedicated melee units might actually mean that they get worse positioning rather than better if you take them off and put them down again. It's also perhaps a bit unfortunate they hit on a 2+, making that +1 to hit stratagem useless. Otherwise, Vanguard Spearhead could give them stealth and cover at greater than 12 inches, making them yet more of a pain to remove. They also have some reactive movement shenanigans as well, recoiling from enemy charges, and they seem like they'd be one of the better options to infiltrate with a character for a turn 1 charge threat. Being able to put them down in the midfield and then just march up and hopefully delete something turn 1 could be very scary, and it certainly feels like they've got enough durability to justify being on the front lines like that. Otherwise, Stormlance allows them to advance and charge, and I guess might support some Ravenwing units if you're choosing to take them alongside, and Firestorm has a +1 to wound stratagem. Certainly doesn't hurt for the power weapons in close combat, though as mentioned probably not quite as big a deal for the maces most of the time. Overall though, it's really quite cool to see these guys actually get strong again. It does seem that they're being taken in favour of the rest of the Space Marine assault type units, people generally considering them as overall better than things like Terminator assault squads and standard Deathwing. The extra 50 or so points that you pay for the extra durability and extra melee threat seems to be considered overall worth it. Dark Angels Gladius list broadly seem to be going for them plus Inner Circle companions, again with a big boost in melee damage stats, with little representation for other Codex Space Marine close combat options. I must admit they do look like they'd be a really good fun unit to use. I can see the appeal of running say 3 squads of them without a character. 235 points times 3 gives you an incredibly scary shield line that can catch and delete things that move up into the midboard, and then the rest of the list can be more supporting them, taking other close combat threats to move up or a bit of scary fire support. I feel like the characters are usable but definitely not mandatory, and he could just stick with the base Terminator loadout. I think I would go with the maces myself to make them a bit more general purpose. And the great weapon with all the devastating wounds does seem nice, though I feel like there maybe isn't quite as much between that and the relic weapon, given the lethal hits and extra attack. Depending on the matchup, it might vary a bit, depending on exactly how I'd want to play them. I'd certainly like to keep at least some units on the board to stomp up towards the midfield objectives, unless there's a very real chance of them just getting move blocked and denied. And otherwise, I'd certainly consider one squad perhaps for a rapid ingress type role as a way to get them there. Though it might depend a little bit as to whether the opponent's got good screening or not. In general, I feel like the way to play with them would be just to make them move up and dominate the mid-board objectives and make the opponent have to deal with their great toughness if they want to win the game. I feel like if you put, say, the entire force down on one objective, then perhaps they could just try and ignore that, or maybe screen or move block it. So perhaps going for multiple points on the mid-board would be a good idea. Ideally, it would be nice to have them moving up alongside other Space Marine more skirmish type things, perhaps supported by scouts or other things that could deal with smaller annoying units that aren't worthy of their time, and perhaps something ready to jump in with a bit of objective control if the enemy does try and swarm them with a lot of OC2 bodies or something. In any case, really cool to see the Deathwing Knights actually looking good again. Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. Have you been playing with or against these since the update? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, an automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.